Thank you for choosing my video to watch. I appreciate the support. Here we have 3 scary stories based on some urban legends. Do you know any urban legends? Please comment below.
For decades, the small town of Millfield had been plagued by a terrifying urban legend that spread like wildfire amongst its residents and visitors alike, the story of the Shadow Man. The tale was gruesome, and it went that a man, horribly disfigured and exiled from society, had been condemned to live in the woods outside of town. He was said to be a malevolent creature, lurking in the darkness, waiting for unsuspecting prey to wander too far from the safety of the town's borders. If you did, he would find you, and drag you back into the shadows, never to be seen or heard from again. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the Shadow Man was nothing more than a myth, most people in Millfield remained wary of the woods surrounding their town. The fear was palpable, and no one dared to venture too far out into the woods after dark. However, for a group of teenagers, the legend was too tempting to ignore. One summer, a group of thrill-seeking teenagers from the town decided to investigate the legend of the Shadow Man. They set out on a hike into the woods, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure. As they walked deeper and deeper into the forest, the air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees towered high above them, casting long shadows in the dimming light. Suddenly, they heard a rustling noise behind them. They turned to look, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man, dark and shapeless, with eyes that gleamed in the light of their flashlights. He moved silently, and seemed to be getting closer with every passing second. Panic set in, and the teenagers tried to flee, but it was too late. The Shadow Man was upon them, grabbing one of the group and dragging him back into the darkness. The rest of the group ran as fast as they could back to town, terrified and traumatized by what they had witnessed. They told the authorities what had happened, but the police could find no trace of the missing teenager, nor any evidence that the Shadow Man even existed. Despite the lack of evidence, the incident shook the town to its core. The once vibrant community was now gripped by fear, and people lived in constant dread of venturing out beyond the safety of their homes. The teenagers who had been lucky enough to escape with their lives would never forget the horrors they had witnessed, and the legend of the Shadow Man continued to haunt the town for generations to come. The woods that once served as a playground for the children of Millfield now stood as a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond the town's borders. The tale of the Shadow Man was no longer a mere legend but a brutal reality that left an indelible mark on the town's psyche. Even to this day, some residents of Millfield claim to have seen the Shadow Man lurking in the darkness, waiting for his next victim to wander too far from the safety of their homes.
I hope you enjoy the content I upload. If you like what I'm doing, why not think about clicking on the subscribe button to keep up to date on my uploads. Thank you all for the great support. Once upon a time, nestled deep in the heart of a remote forest, there was a small village. The villagers lived their lives peacefully, tending to their crops and livestock, until the day they discovered a secret about one of their own. The rumor was that there was a man who lived on the outskirts of the village who had made a deal with the devil himself. The man had sold his soul in exchange for extraordinary powers and abilities, including the ability to communicate with the dead. At first, the villagers didn't believe the tale. They thought it was just a myth, a story to scare children. But as time went on, strange things began to happen. The man's powers grew stronger, and he started to control the spirits of the dead. The man's reign of terror began slowly, with small, unexplainable events. But as the villagers grew more and more frightened, he started to use his abilities to wreak havoc on their lives. He would cause storms and droughts, make animals go mad, and even control the thoughts and actions of those around him. The villagers knew they had to act. They hired a group of skilled hunters and trackers, who were tasked with capturing the man and bringing him to justice. The hunters set out into the dense woods that surrounded the village, with only the flicker of their torches to guide them. As they journeyed deeper into the forest, they began to hear strange noises and see eerie lights flickering in the darkness. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as they approached the clearing where the man was rumored to reside. Suddenly, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, the sound of hundreds of spirits moaning and groaning in unison. The hunters watched in horror as the man emerged from the darkness, surrounded by a horde of the dead that he had summoned to do his bidding. With a wave of his hand, the spirits began to attack the hunters, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The hunters fought back with all their might, swinging their swords and firing their arrows. But no matter how hard they fought, they couldn't stop the onslaught. The battle was long and brutal. Many of the hunters lost their lives that night, their bodies torn apart by the ghostly army. In the end, the man vanished into the darkness, leaving the hunters to lick their wounds and mourn their fallen comrades. To this day, the legend of the man who made a deal with the devil lives on. The locals swear that his spirit still haunts the wooded area where he once resided, and that the spirits of the dead still do his bidding. Some even claim that they've seen the man himself, wandering the forest in search of new victims to add to his ghostly army. But one thing is for certain. The villagers of that small village will never forget the horror that they faced that dark and stormy night.
Once upon a time, in the quiet town of Oakwood, the legend of the Slenderman was known to every child and adult alike. A creature of pure darkness, with unnaturally long limbs and a featureless face, it was said that those who dared to wander into the woods at night would be doomed to fall under his gaze. One summer, a group of teenagers decided to put the legend to the test. They were a group of friends, brimming with youthful energy and a desire for adventure. They had heard stories of the Slenderman before, but they had never seen him themselves. They were convinced that the legend was just a silly tale, something that parents told their children to keep them from wandering into the woods at night. One evening, they made a plan to explore the woods. They met at the edge of the forest just as the sun was beginning to set, carrying with them flashlights and backpacks filled with snacks and supplies. They were full of excitement, eager to see what the woods held in store for them. The forest was dense and dark, the trees towering above them like shadowy giants. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, and the sky was a deep, ominous shade of purple. The group walked along the narrow dirt path, their footsteps crunching on the twigs and leaves underfoot. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they began to feel a sense of unease. The air grew thick with an oppressive, heavy feeling that seemed to weigh down on them. It was as if the forest itself was trying to discourage them from continuing their journey. But they pressed on, their curiosity getting the better of them. They walked for what seemed like hours, their flashlights illuminating the way ahead. Suddenly, one of them stopped in their tracks. "Do you see that?" they asked, pointing into the darkness. The others looked where they were pointing, but they could see nothing but the blackness of the forest. "What do you see?" one of them asked. "I don't know," the first replied. "It's like there's something moving out there." The others tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, but the unease that had been growing inside them began to turn to fear. As they continued to walk, their flashlights began to flicker and dim. The batteries were draining quickly, despite the fact that they had only just replaced them. They tried to ignore it and kept walking, but the feeling of being watched became stronger and stronger. It wasn't long before they heard the sound of footsteps behind them. They turned around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer, until they were practically on top of them. Suddenly, one of them let out a scream. There, standing in front of them, was the Slenderman. It was even more terrifying than they had imagined. Its limbs were longer and more twisted than they had ever thought possible, and its face was nothing but a featureless, white expanse. It wore a suit, just as the legends had described. The group of teenagers turned to run, but the Slenderman was too fast. Its long limbs seemed to stretch out impossibly far, wrapping around them and pulling them in. They screamed and struggled, but there was no escape. One by one, they were dragged into the darkness, swallowed up by the Slenderman in the forest itself. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but no one ever saw the teenagers again. They became just another group of victims, claimed by the legend of the Slenderman.